Chapter 6. The Killer Inside the Home. The light falling through the windows into the hall where the High Council was meeting shifted from the table to the knight. An unusual silence fell over the crowd in the hall. Occasionally they were disturbed by the narrative, shifting in their seats, crossing themselves and saying prayers in whispers, but they continued to listen to Allain de Bures. No one touched the jugs or mugs on the table, nor interrupted the knight for a moment. "And how did you proceed with this investigation, knight?" asked Marshal Godfrey de Sonnac. Allain de Bures straightened his posture and said with a sigh, "By returning to the streets, Marshal de Sonnac. Because this menace had spread to almost the whole of Jerusalem. The streets were dark and deserted. The weather had cooled down and the wind had died down. There was no street lighting back then, so darkness was something the city was used to. Normally Sebastian would have picked up a lantern and walked ahead of his noble master, lighting the way. But Allain found the light of the stars and the crescent moon sufficient. Allain and Thomas led the way, followed by Sebastian and Eric. The shutters of the houses that served as windows were closed and the lights were out. The grunts and hoofbeats of their horses echoed and seemed to multiply in the silence. Thomas thought that something was watching them in the darkness. But he could see nothing to prove it. He took one last look into the darkness, swallowed and said, "My lord?" "Yes, Thomas?" asked Allain. "That land of the Indians, where the Chinese are?" asked the young man. "Before that, my son," said Allain. "Is it normal for them to be here? Aren't they far away?" "You don't get out of the temple much, do you?" asked Allain, amused. "No, my lord," said Thomas. "Where did you come from?" "France, my lord," said Thomas. "How did you get here? By sea or by land?" "Via the port of Messina, my lord." "I see, Indians are common here," said Allain. "Is that so, my lord?" said Thomas, surprised. "Yes, they even have a temple in the north quarter." "What heathen religion do they believe in?" "Hindu, Thomas," said Allain. "Hindu? I understand, my lord," said Thomas. "And Thomas?" "Yes, my lord. When you are on the streets, especially if you are outnumbered by people of other religions, try not to call their religion heathen. They might kill you if they are not people you have known for years." "But my lord, our religion is the only true religion and the key to salvation, and chivalry teaches us to be honest." "It does not preach it, my son, it commands it, you swear to it. Some clerics will tell you that this oath does not apply to heretics, but as you swear you will realize that your oath binds you to every created soul. Even if you did not swear an oath of kindness and mercy, these are the qualities of a true Christian." "Even if they are heretics?" "Even if they are your enemies, Thomas. Chivalry is more than just a well-trained, well-equipped warrior." "I understand, my lord," said Thomas. But the weight of those words didn't seem to sink in at the moment. Eric, meanwhile, was constantly looking behind him, around him, occasionally stroking and calming the young horse, which was fretting. The first thing the temple did as Allain's apprentice was to give him a horse, a sword and a white tunic with a chainmail. Sebastian and Thomas watched in amazement as Eric quickly stuffed them into the mule's saddlebags and quickly wrapped the sword in a blanket, as if he had a contagious disease. Because all the novices, all the knight candidates they had ever known would have gladly sacrificed their right arm for what Eric had been given. Eric put on his dark clothes, put all his daggers in their places, happily placed the Mongolian swords on his back and the sword the Grand Master had given him among the cooks instead of the swords. His agitated demeanor triggered Thomas, who kept looking around with him. Thomas was in the dormitory where Eric slept. He had seen how Eric had knocked out the dormitory guard. It wasn't that he did it that made Thomas nervous, it was the ease with which he did it. In fact, Thomas was the one who had sent the recruits to the training ground. Allain saw Thomas looking around and asked, "What is it, young man?" "My lord, your slave, the savage is very agitated." Allain turned to look at Eric. The young man didn't look at him, didn't even seem interested. "He has good reason." Allain said with a wry smile. Should we be nervous too? Only when Eric draws his swords, whistles, snaps his fingers. Allain said calmly. As Thomas listened, he realized that Allain was also checking corners, rooftops, dark alleyways. He looked relaxed, but in fact he was alert, ready for a collision. This time Thomas only nodded. Meanwhile, Allain pointed with his head to the inn they had just entered. By the time they entered the One-Eyed Man Inn, most of the customers had already gone home and those who were staying had gone to their rooms. The two men tidied up the place and wiped the table with a dirty cloth. Seeing Allain and those who entered with her, Aziz Osman started laughing and said, "They were early." "Tell them my room is ready," said Allain, knowing he deserved the laughter. Aziz sent one of the staff to fetch the horses outside. There was a stable behind the inn where his customers were. "Ready, upstairs, end of the hall," he said to Allain. "We need another room," Allain grumbled, nodding at Sebastian and Thomas. "Oh, no doubt about it. It's okay." He squinted as he saw Eric coming in. He didn't recognize the young man, but he looked very familiar. "And who is this young man?" "Eric, my rookie." "Ah," Aziz said, starting to laugh again. "You're not going to start all over again, are you?" said Allain. No, said Aziz quickly, with a look that recalled years and years of friendship and who knows what funny incident. Aziz narrowed his eyes, gave up on whatever he was going to say and said, "Aziz," as he walked to the stairs. "Yes." "If I hired 5 Indian killers, would I still go to the Alexandrian?" he asked. Aziz ran through all the scum in the city in his head, grimaced and said, "Yes, Indians wouldn't be my first choice, but for those interested in that kind of work, Alexandrian is the first one that comes to mind." "Then we'll start there tomorrow," Allain grumbled, shaking his head. "You're not talking about something that concerns me, are you?" Aziz asked from behind him. "Of course not," he heard Allain say from the darkened staircase and smiled. Then he looked at the stairs again. That boy. He was so familiar. In the morning, the holy city of Jerusalem woke up and the day dwellers, those who had to endure the sun and the heat, came out. Allain bought Thomas and Sebastian robes to travel in, casual but durable clothes, to conceal their weapons and habits. "You are so committed to being a knight that you walk like them, stand like them, carry weapons like them," Allain said to Thomas, who looked at his robes with questioning eyes. Allain and Eric were once again dressed in their everyday clothes and covered their heads with the Muslim headscarves. If they walked in the bazaar, they would blend in with the crowd and no one would look at them twice. "Isn't that a good thing, my lord?" Thomas asked. "If we can raise a banner and march around with bugles, giving every bastard involved in the assassination a chance to hide, great. But our employer wants us to do it quietly and firmly." "I understand, my lord," Thomas said sheepishly. "You will soon realize the difference in our ways, young de Vullen," Allain said patiently, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. Allain and his small group left Street Nicholas Square behind and entered Street Joseph Street. The sun had not yet broken through the high walls. Merchants were opening their shops and lining the stalls with their wares. Farm workers were marching to the city gates, which opened at dawn, and inns were preparing for the pilgrims. The city's biggest source of income was the money left in the city by pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem, holy to all 3 major religions. When they reached the empty parts of the street, the pigeons, disturbed by the horses, took off. "Who shall we see, my lord?" Thomas said as he looked after the pigeons. "Have you heard of the Alexandrian?" asked Allain, making sure that he hadn't set those pigeons in the air himself. "No, my lord," said Thomas. "He hires mercenaries and guards. Mostly to caravans. But sometimes he finds discreet men for short-term jobs." "What do we need men like that for?" said Thomas. "Murder, robbery and uglier things," said Allain, turning into an alleyway. "And why doesn't the kingdom or the temple punish this sinner?" said Thomas quickly. "Because we want him to commit those sins, Thomas." said Allain with a smile. He stopped in front of a two-story house surrounded by walls. The experienced knight glanced at the door and his surroundings for a brief moment, then unbuckled his cloak in distress, letting it fall over the horse's back. Meanwhile Eric snapped his fingers twice. Thomas and Sebastian looked at him in surprise, remembering what Allain had said last night. But why? Thought Thomas. There was no one in the street. Allain said solemnly, Thomas, Sebastian, stay in the street. And drew his sword. His red-guarded sword was made of Damascus steel. Both young men looked at it in amazement. They had never seen a knight's sword made of Damascus steel before. Thomas was looking at him and his swords in amazement. Sebastian was already dismounted, his short sword drawn. What's going on? The young knight's apprentice asked as he drew his sword. Without speaking, Allain pointed to the drops of blood on the doorway and the lamps on either side of the door. The lamps were still burning. As Allain approached to open the door, he saw thick, metal-covered arrowheads sticking out of the door. Someone had shot a crossbow bolt at the door. Allain tensed. He hated crossbows. The damned things could pierce a full suit of armor or chainmail without difficulty in the short distance between the house and the wall. Thomas, meanwhile, watched in amazement as Eric leapt like an acrobat onto the horse's back, jumped from his back to the wall and then across the garden. At the same moment Allain charged at the gate. The big knight could hardly open it. As he had expected, behind the door were the bodies of two guards. Allain looked at Eric, who had jumped into the garden and moved silently. Eric checked the man in front of him. The sword of one of the guards was in his chest. Ahead were two men with crossbows, killed with throwing knives. Bloody foam foamed from the men's mouths, so the daggers were poisoned. Allain looked back at the gate and the garden. He was the only one who had come in. The gatekeepers knew him, so they hadn't drawn their swords. But the man who had entered had killed them very quickly, throwing the sword of one of the gatekeepers to the lookout next door and throwing knives to the other two crossbowmen. The door of the large house was broken, swinging loosely. Allain kicked the door open and Eric stepped inside. In the dim hallway lay the bodies of two mercenaries. The large living room was furnished like an office. Another man had been killed in front of the large desk. Allain looked around and muttered, "The Alexandrian isn't here," looking at the flat strip of blood on the wall. Eric touched the puddle of blood on the floor and crushed it between his fingers. "Yes," Allain said as he sheathed his sword. "It happened after midnight." Thomas said, "Master Allain is indeed a wise man. The magistra was quite right to put him on this case." "Not just wisdom, sir," Sebastian said nervously. He kept his horse steady, looking through the ajar gate at the bodies in the garden. "What happened, Sebastian?" asked Thomas. "They are not ordinary people," growled the young Servians. "What do you mean?" asked Thomas, looking at him curiously. Sebastian, being a Servians, was up early and went to their room to help Allain get dressed. When he opened the door he saw Eric in a handstand, his body curled backwards. He moved up and down, curled like a spring. The muscles in his arms, shoulders and back bulged. Allain stood over him, supervising him, tying strips of lead to his arms and legs, just as Eric had done. Allain smiled when he saw Sebastian staring at him, and gently asked him to make him breakfast. "These men have trained themselves very differently from knights," Sebastian said. Thomas and Sebastian stretched to look at the street entrances and their surroundings, and at the entrance to the alley a Saracen watched them from beneath his long robe and closed hood. The man's head was wrapped in a dark blue headband and his bushy mustache stretched to either side of his chin. When the robed island saw them coming from the back of the street, he kept walking slowly. These men had been following Allain de Bures and his team since the temple. He did not want them to recognize him. Bernard, who hadn't slept properly after last night's events, looked at the crowded street and the city guards trying to disperse the crowd. The entire narrow street belonged to Benjamin Matthias. Benjamin Matthias was an old, short, pot-bellied man who smiled at children on the street, asked them riddles, gave them money to buy candy if they knew, was always smiling, always had at least 2, sometimes 3 jokes in his head to make you laugh, and was a regular donor to several soup kitchens in Jerusalem. Benjamin was also one of the city's most famous moneylenders. He owned the only space in the alley where the shop he ran his business was located, and there was a small stable across the street. When Bernard arrived at the man's shop in the alley, he looked at the mules drawn by the city guards and the cart attached to them, and the captain of the city guards, coming out from behind the cart carrying bales of hay, nodded to Bernard. "The most imaginative work I've ever seen," he said, pointing to the wagon. Each man with a crossbow aimed at a specific target, and they cleared the entire street at once. Bernard looked around absent-mindedly, at the children watching them from the roof of the building across the street, at the young women who smiled at him as they passed by, at the Saracen who quickened their pace when they saw the city guard, at the old beggar who was crouched at the foot of a wall across the street. "Nobody saw anything, heard anything?" he asked. The alley connected the street to St. Peter's Square, so it was rarely deserted. "No one came to the city guard, my lord, they didn't want to get caught in the middle," said the captain. Benjamin was a loan shark, and because of his connections with other illegal people and groups, if anyone saw anything, they wouldn't report it to the city guard. Bernard approached the cart curiously and saw that inside the cart the hay bales had been placed vertically, creating a space in the middle. In this space were 4 crossbows. The 2 on the street side of the hay bales had fallen at the entrance to the street. Bernard dismounted, handed the horse's bridle to a young city guard. "The same men?" he asked as he shook the captain's hand. There were 4 dead guards in the street, all 4 with crossbow bolts in their chests. The captain nodded. "There are 3 more guards inside." "His family?" asked Bernard. The marshal had no family, but all the servants in the house had been killed, and the Genoese's family had been tortured. "Old Benji has only one daughter. A few streets down, in a big house." "Did you talk to him?" "I thought you might want to talk. But I sent the men away and she wasn't there." "Have they kidnapped her?" grumbled Bernard, and then the young knight looked behind him, the fallen hay, together with the cart full of hay, obscuring the entrance to the street and the view of those inside. "Benjamin?" asked Bernard. "He's inside too," said the captain, spitting on the ground. The long, dimly lit hall was full of bodies and blood. It began to smell like a mixture of blood and human excrement. There were 3 employees, 3 guards and Benjamin. Benjamin was tied to a chair, tortured just like the Genoese cartographer and the marshal. "The neighbors said that car had been there since noon yesterday," the captain said. "So they got here before the Genoese?" said Bernard, looking at the blood on the wall opposite where the old man had died. "Yes, and they rode horses as they rode away." "And?" said Bernard, looking at a severed hand on the ground. "They said that 7 strangely dressed seraphs, led by a large man, took 3 bodies that looked like them with them." "Indian?" Bernard said as he picked up the extremely dark hand on the ground and looked around for anyone left without a hand. "My lord?" "The men were Indian." "Ah, that makes sense," said the captain. "So there were 10 when they were here and 7 when they attacked the Genoese. Were those 3 who died in the alley?" "No, my lord, they had just died." "That leaves 5. The young man grunted. "Are we going to look for 5 Indians, my lord?" "No need to search, they attacked the wrong person and died," said Bernard. "Did you just find the bodies?" he asked, checking the blood on the ground with his foot. The blood had already started to crack and the corpse was already stinking from the heat. "Yes, my lord, they just informed me." "Do you still have the money?" asked Bernard. "The ones our boys couldn't swipe," said the captain. He hadn't seen his men steal the moneylender's money, but he knew they had done it. He was a realist, he knew how weak his men were in this respect. "Then it's not money they're worried about," said Bernard, equally worldly. "How could such a thing," said the captain, shaking his head from side to side, "be done?" "I don't know," Bernard said. He looked around in distress. The victims he had been watching and the attack on the Grand Master were now merging. He hadn't seen this yesterday, he hadn't been able to put it together in his head. At the time he had been so upset and angry at the loss of Arnaldo de Paines that he had not made the connection, Lead your men street by street, captain, see where the horsemen go. He grumbled. Yes, my lord. Bernard sighed as the captain sent his men out. Now he had to find Allain de Bures. The sun had broken through the walls and was beating down on the light sand-colored or white walls of the city. A strong wind from the west was blowing the dust of the wasteland into the city, testing people's will to live. "And is the man we are looking for dead, Master de Bures?" asked Thomas, who had pulled his cloak and hood over his head and a thin cloth covering over his mouth and nose. "I don't think so, Thomas. Running away is what Mawf ibn Rashid of Alexandria does best," said Allain comfortably. A large procession of pilgrims was passing by on Green Sycamore Street, and Allain and his team gave way for the tired, exhausted, dust-covered, invisibly distraught people to pass. There was a strange look of peace and triumph on their faces. Their skin, exposed from burning and dehydration, was torn to shreds. Some of them had torn boots, some had broken the straps of their sandals, some were already walking barefoot. An old woman passing by stopped and smiled at them, said a blessing, touched Allain's horse's nose, and then kept walking. Allain didn't know where the old woman had come from, but he was sure he couldn't go back the way he had come. When they dismounted in front of the old church in the middle of Green Sycamore Street, Eric touched Allain's wrist, his hood up, his face in shadow. "Yes, we're being followed," Allain said as he tied the horse to the post in front of the church. When Eric sighed and looked at him, he muttered, "No, I don't know who they are, but they're Armand's men." "Why would Right Hand have us followed?" grumbled Thomas. "Why?" said Allain. "The temple's intelligence is handled by the Deputy Grand Master. Right Hand commands the spies." Seeing the look Eric gave him, he said, "No, he's not my commander." "Who are the followers?" asked Thomas naively, to which Sebastian replied, "They're around the corner, sir, those two men under the tree." "Do you recognize them?" asked Allain, smiling. "Yes, sir, Harold and Reynald of the Knights Templar," Sebastian said with a nod, smiling until his eyes became lines. "Shall we lose them?" said Thomas. Allain smiled and said, "Do you know the first two things not to do when you realize you are being followed, Thomas?" "No, my lord." "Don't show you realize it and don't dodge them. If you do, they will send more men after you, bigger and more skillful." And then he said, "Wait here," and went into the church. Two old Arabs who had prayed in the old church greeted Allain as they came out slowly. Allain nodded and walked past them to the priest who was wiping the large icon of Christ with a cloth, knelt down and crossed himself. "Allain, I heard you were dead," said the white, bushy-haired, bushy-bearded priest, who was not looking at him. "Tiberius," Allain said to the round-shaped priest, "God is not so merciful," he said, standing up and sitting in the first pew with the well-built priest, who was actually not very old. The church was not large, its dome-shaped roof covered in intricately patterned ornaments. Colorful light poured in through the stained glass windows of the cool temple. "Did you come to the city yesterday?" said the man with light blue eyes and thick eyebrows. "Yes, why?" asked Allain. "The city has been extra chaotic since yesterday. I wondered why," said the priest, laughing. Allain started laughing and said, "Thank you. I'm always happy to have your trust," as two old women came into the church. The priest gestured to Allain to the side canopy, and as they came to the edge of the wall they both began to whisper, "The facts and the evidence are clear, brother. Are you investigating the attack on the Grand Master?" "How could you have heard of it?" said Allain. "Did you not come to me because I heard the whispers of the city?" said the priest, bowing to them and the way women of his age greeted them. "3 people were killed yesterday and the Alexandrian escaped." Allain sighed, "Yes, we discovered him." "Wait, 3? Who died besides the Genoese and Payanes?" he asked curiously. "Benjamin Matahias, the moneylender, if you want to start with him." "Why him?" said Allain, frowning. "He's the closest victim," Tiberius said nonchalantly. But Allain knew well that he was always hiding something behind simple truths. Tiberius was the eyes and ears of Rome here and the leader of the black men. And all Allain wanted was a small starting point, and Benjamin's death was it. Wait a minute. Wasn't that new kid in charge of this? The marshal's son. What was his name? Oh yes, Bernard. The sun had risen high, over Jerusalem's high walls, the wind had died down, the heat was now testing the will of the people with heat. In the crowded street, people moved fluidly, few paying attention to the street blocked off by the city guard. On Bernard's orders, the bodies in the street had been moved aside and covered with blankets. The sky was covered with large, bulky clouds, hurrying past them as if in a hurry. When Allain and his men rode up on their horses, the city guard was about to rudely order them to move away, when the senior knight flashed his ring and asked, in a tone of command that had lost none of its warmth and friendliness, "Is the knight Bernard de Sonnac here?" In the corner, "My lord is speaking to a witness," the young city guard said quickly, suddenly straightening his posture. "Run fetch him," Allain said without giving him a second look. Thomas watched him transform from a teacher into a commander. After a moment's indecision, the city guard broke into a final run. Meanwhile, Allain looked around. Thomas looked at him curiously. Allain de Bures was a real lesson in how and where to behave. "My lord, you commanded me," Bernard said solemnly, emerging from the crowd. The city guards he had sent were searching for traces, but the trail of the fugitives was dwindling street by street. It had been too long, and people were becoming careless. Bernard wasn't surprised to run into Allain when he was thinking of finding him. The intersection of their tracks suggested that such an encounter was inevitable. "It seems that the heretics we have been following are on the same path," said Allain. "Yes, my lord, it seems so." "What happened here?" said Allain as he dismounted. "Benjamin the pawnbroker and his men were killed, along with the customers," Bernard said, pointing to the narrow road and the shop at the end of it. "How many did they lose?" said Allain as he looked around. "3, my lord," Bernard said. "Good plan to attack by car," said Allain, as if admiring his enemy. "You spoke to my men?" said Bernard. He was standing at the head of the street, he could see the entrance from where he stood, he was sure Allain and the others had just arrived. "There was no need," Allain said. "There's hay at the street entrance. There's animal droppings in that corner, so they must have come yesterday and pulled the car into the entrance. They knocked over the hay and made a surprise attack. They broke into the building and finished them off, then," he said, pointing to the dark droplet stains on the ground, mixed with dust, "then they escaped with the horses inside," he said, starting to walk. Bernard walked after him, looking at the places and clues he had pointed out and said, "You are very good at this, my lord." As they passed old boxes, barrels and a few piles of wood, Allain just nodded, pointed to the stable across the street from the shop and said, "Thomas, Sebastian, look in the stable, let us know how many horses have been taken." As the novice and the servants went into the stable, Allain nodded to Eric to follow him. Bernard looked at the young man with a hatred and contempt he didn't even try to hide. He would finish his unfinished business in the Grand Master's chambers at the first opportunity. A slave was no match for a knight of noble blood. "Have you found anything, Bernard?" Allain asked as he walked in. "No, my lord, we only know that there were 10 Indians and 1 Christian who suddenly appeared. I sent men to the Indian quarter and the Hindu temple." Allain paused and looked at the magic symbols in the door beams. Curious, he ran his fingers over the beam. Bernard had seen these symbols but had ignored them. "What are they?" he asked, not understanding why Allain would care about a bunch of old, faded heretic symbols when there were so many dead people. "Protection magic," muttered Allain de Bures. "Well, it didn't work, my lord," Bernard said with a mocking tone in his voice. "How foolish the superstitions of the heathens were." "These symbols are not for them," said Allain. "They are for the nocturnal." And then he looked towards the exit of the alley. There stood a seraph in his robes, watching them. He was as uninterested in them as the people passing by were uninterested in him. He was just looking at Allain. While Bernard was looking where he was looking, a rider and some people passed in front of him. When they scattered, Saracen was not there. Allain smiled, almost as if he had expected it, and then went inside. When the knight saw the bodies in the hall he entered, he grimaced and said, "Nothing will come of the Indian quarter in the temple, young man." "Why, my lord?" said Bernard, fidgeting uncomfortably. "They worship Kali, a dark goddess, they are hired killers, and they were taken from Alexandria. No one would say they knew such men. Those who do will go to the gallows or be banished from the city." "Did you talk to the Alexandrian?" asked the captain. He was not at all surprised that the carrion crow had a part in this. "No, captain," said Allain. "All his men were killed and he escaped." He looked behind the counter. A young man's chest and abdomen had been ripped open and the contents had come out, and Allain grunted, "Oh my God." Then he turned and frowned as he examined Benjamin's body, tied to the chair. "Is this how the marshal and the Genoese were killed, young man?" "Yes, my lord, we cannot understand why they would do such a monstrous thing," Bernard said. They interrogated. Allain grunted as he saw the blood stain on the side wall, splattered drops of blood forming a ribbon. "Oh shit!" he grunted. "What?" "The wounds are all superficial, they broke the bones of the fingers, the open wounds are cauterized like fingers cut off to avoid blood loss. It was an interrogation, they were trying to get something out of old Benji," said Allain. "How do you know that?" said Bernard, puzzled. "We teach you how to do that, son," Allain said with a sigh. "Excuse me?" said Bernard, looking at him puzzled. "How do you think the Knights Templar make their prisoners talk, Bernard de Sonnac?" said Allain, studying him with a frown. It's. Bernard was at a loss for words. There shouldn't be anything so dark in the brotherhood, it was unchristian after all. "What?" said Allain, giving him a chance to finish his sentence. "Unacceptable," Bernard said in a breath. Allain smiled and nodded, "Your father raised you too well." And Eric snapped his fingers. When they all looked at them, Eric pointed to a wooden shelf fixed to the wall behind the counter. Papers, rolls and notebooks had fallen from the shelf in front of it. As Allain drew his sword, the captain and Bernard jumped over the bodies and switched places. When Allain nodded, Eric pulled the shelf towards him. When the shelf didn't come, Benjamin was about to say, "What do you think you're doing, you idiot?" when he saw the arc-shaped marks on the floor. The dust that came in with the dust storm had made those marks visible. Eric searched for the mechanism to move the shelf and finally found it hidden under a shelf. The door opened with a mechanical click and a white ghost screamed and threw itself at Eric. But Eric did not believe in ghosts, he realized that the blur that was thrown at him was a woman. He quickly grabbed the dagger wrist that she swung at him, wrapped his arm around her slender waist and threw her over his waist to the floor. When the young woman hit the ground, he quickly twisted his wrist, snatched the dagger from her hand and pressed the curved, white bone dagger's shiny blade against her slender neck. At the same moment Allain commanded, "Eric, stop." This order was the only thing that saved the life of the beautiful young woman with black curly hair. The young woman who emerged from the secret chamber behind the shelf was Charlotte Ava Matahias, Benjamin's only daughter. They immediately took her outside, washed her face and hands and gave her water. But the young woman was in no condition to speak. She had already fainted after a few heartbeats. Allain took the young woman back to her home, leaving Thomas and Sebastian in charge of transporting Benjamin and the other victims for the funeral. Benjamin's wife had died last year. The old servants in his grand mansion had been devastated by the news of her death and had immediately taken the young woman to her room. Allain and the others were afraid that they would have to wait to speak to her when she came back. She had changed her clothes and tidied her hair. In the courtyard, they sat on a couple of cushions with vine leaves covering the tops. The young woman sat up straight as if she had swallowed a stick, trying not to look tired, exhausted or distraught. With eyes red from crying and anger in her eyes, she kept talking and talking. The attack had been sudden, One of the men outside had fallen making strange noises and Samuel at the counter had lured him into the secret compartment. Charlotte had watched the whole atrocity and hadn't dared to come out. In a dry voice she said, "There were 10 Indians and a knight. My father's guards killed 3 of them." "How did you know they were Indians?" asked Allain. Bernard looked at him puzzled. Wasn't the knight the most important detail? Why wasn't he asking about that? "My father worked with Indians, sir," said the beautiful woman. Her voice was soft, elegant, subtle. Maybe if she sang they could listen to her all day without getting bored. "And how do you know the other man was a knight? Did he have armor?" asked Allain. "No, my lord, he was disguised like you, but he had no ring. I recognized him by the arrogant demeanor of the knights." Allain almost smiled. The young woman was indeed sharp-tongued. She looked at Eric for a brief moment. Eric was watching her with curiosity and interest. "Did the knight do the torture?" Allain asked. "Yes," the young woman said, turning her head to the side as if her father was right in front of her and she didn't want to see him anymore. "What was he looking for?" "I'll tell you if you take me with you," she said, suddenly turning her large almond-shaped eyes to Allain. Allain raised one eyebrow curiously and asked, "Why do you want to come with us, ma'am?" The woman's slender fingers with delicate wrists clenched the handkerchief in her palm into a fist. Her angry, cruel voice said in a commanding tone, "I have to make sure you get your revenge." She said it so cruelly that even Bernard flinched away from her. Allain shook his head and stood up, holding out his hand to the young woman. "You can be sure that we will bring you justice, but we cannot guarantee your safety if you wish to come with us, young lady, and only the Grand Master can decide on such an arrangement." The young woman angrily grabbed Allain's hand and stood up. "Then I will see him," she said firmly. Bernard was sure she would not be allowed inside the temple, but he would not be the one to tell her. "No, sir," he was not afraid. But the tiny young woman looked like a piece of burning steel and Bernard in his heart absolutely did not want to mess with her. Charlotte pulled herself together, changed her clothes and saddled one of her horses. Then the small group of Allain, Bernard, Eric and Charlotte left the Matthias household and headed back down the same street. Thomas and Sebastian were to return to the inn and gather the supplies, weapons and tools that Allain had asked for. Bernard rode with Allain, and Eric rode with Charlotte at Allain's command. As they approached Benjamin Street, Bernard said, "Captain Harold has recognized you, Saint Knight, you have interesting ways." To break the silence between them. He thought he had already seen Allain's deductions on the street. But the captain had seen him do it too, hadn't he? What else could be unusual? Allain turned back a little on his horse and looked at Eric and Charlotte. Eric gestured with his eyes and shoulder and then made the 2 sign. The 2 were still watching them. He didn't give her any obvious answer, turning back in front of him. "Interesting? Maybe," said Allain at the end of the street, looking at the beggar with his back against a wall. "Do you have 2 gold coins, young man?" he asked as if he had just thought of something. A surprised Bernard looked around and said, "Well, 2 gold coins?" "Yes, I need 2 gold coins." "Of course I do," said the young man. He took 2 gold coins from his belt and put them in Allain's palm. Allain dismounted under Bernard's curious, then bewildered gaze. He placed it in the broken clay pot of an old, emaciated beggar with a sparse, long beard, who looked like he was dying of filth. The man had pulled a filthy linen cloth over his eyes to show that he was blind, and turning his head as if looking for him with his sightless eyes, lisped through his missing teeth, "May God grant you whatever you wish, may God give you health, may God prolong your life." The knight got down on one knee in front of the man and bowed to him. "I am Allain de Bures, tell the old man that I pay my respects to the king of the underworld and that I will wait for you in the city of the dead after the evening prayer." Allain stood up and looked around with a smile as the old man kept saying, "God bless you, God," as if he had lost his mind years ago. Bernard was looking at his gold and Allain with raised eyebrows in surprise. Allain smiled and mounted his horse, patting Bernard on the shoulder in a friendly manner. "We are a brotherhood of poor knights, dear brother, we must share what we have with the poor," he said, smiling sweetly. Bernard looked at the poor man's 2 gold pieces, the monthly rent for a house, in his dirty wooden bowl and tried to smile. Allain de Bures was either really extraordinary, or just crazy. Bernard hoped he wasn't crazy. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, the wind picked up again, and with it the dust and sand that had enveloped the city began to beat them again. The sound of the call to prayer echoed from the city, reaching the small group entering through the city gates. "Tie it over your face," Allain said as Bernard bent down to shield his face from the sand. He and Eric had tied the ends of their shemags over their faces. Allain checked behind him. Eric had already made a shemagh out of Charlotte's shawl and tied the ends around the young woman's nose and mouth. "Did you know Arnaldo de Payens, Sir Allain?" Bernard asked as the city guards saluted them, waiting for the last lights to close the gates. "The Count," corrected Allain. "I apologize, Count," said Bernard. "That's all right, young man. Yes, Arnaldo de Payens was our instructor. He was a meticulous man who took his training seriously," he said. "He was your instructor too?" "Yes, Count de Bures." "You can call me Allain, Bernard, you are a sworn knight. That makes us brothers," Allain said, checking his surroundings. "Did you meet him?" "No, Allain. His employees found him in the morning, alerted the city guard, and it took me until noon to get there." "That's why you were galloping out of the temple? Do you remember that?" "The near death of one of my fellow knights is not something easily forgotten," Allain said as she opened her veil. They were now inside the city and the wind and the dust it carried were beginning to die down. "Were you going to kill me for the slave?" Bernard asked curiously, shifting uncomfortably. "No, but no doubt my slave would have killed you." "I was on a horse and I was armored," said Bernard. "Yes," replied Allain, looking at him and smiling. It was as if he was talking about a known fact of the world. Then, changing the subject, "Then Payens was the first to be killed." Bernard thought for a moment, nodded, lowered the cloth from his face and said, "Yes, but..." and then added, "But there was no unusual person or group passing through the city gates." "You warned them this afternoon, didn't you?" "Yes, Allain. But wouldn't 10 Indians and 1 Westerner attract attention?" "Payens was killed by 1 man, Allain said. "Unless there's something wrong with your story, the shape and position of the bodies support that. And 1 man, if he behaves properly, can easily enter any city without attracting attention. Then Benjamin must have come to Matthias, but old Benji was well protected. So he took men from the Alexandrian, killed Benji and then went to the Genoese." He grumbled. Bernard looked at Allain's expression and asked, "So what's bothering you?" "What's the rush?" said Allain. "He could have caught Benjamin at home at night with less protection, he could have caught Guido and his family at night. They wouldn't have to fight with the city guard. Maybe it was just too much opium, or the carelessness of those in league with the devil," Bernard said with conviction. "I hope my dear son will realize in time that neither the devil nor sinners work that way," Allain murmured with a smile. "The king of the underworld will meet you in the city of the dead," she said in a wheezing voice, her hand, like a dried-up twig, touching Allain de Bures's leg. "The king of the underworld will meet you in the city of the dead." Neither Allain nor the woman stopped. Neither Allain nor the woman stopped, neither Allain nor the woman looked at each other. "Keep your eyes on the road, young man," Allain said calmly to Bernard, who attempted to turn to look back as the woman disappeared into the alley of the next house. It was already dark when he arrived at the oldest cemetery in Jerusalem. Charlotte covered her hands to hide her trembling. Her big eyes were wide open, looking around like a rabbit thinking there was a hawk. The young woman's big eyes wandered constantly in the darkness, in the shadows between the stones and crosses, in the trees and overhangs of the old cemetery. She jumped when one of the horses stamped its hoof restlessly. He stroked the horse's head with his trembling little hands and looked at Allain and Bernard standing in the darkness as if nothing was happening. The huge shadows of the 2 big men stood as still as statues, having disappeared as soon as Eric had entered the cemetery. "Calm down, We're just exchanging information. A coyote howled in the distance as a crow flew over, squawking grumpily. Meanwhile, new shadows emerged from the blackness, as if the shadows were darkening and intensifying, turning into bodies. The first two men were quite large, wrapped in cloaks and robes of tattered cloth, like the men they were obviously protecting. "My dear bears, what a pleasant surprise," said the king, smiling at the man in front of the 8 men who spread out like a wall before him when they parted. In fact, he was an ordinary man, no one paid any attention to him. Charlotte still found him frightening. He looked like the man who had killed her father, he smiled, he had a warm voice, but his gaze was the same. "You don't like surprises, John," said Allain. The king paused, turned his head back behind his left shoulder as if he had heard a whisper, "Your man is very good," and then turned to Allain and said, "Will you sell it to me?" Bernard did not realize that Allain's red-haired assistant had disappeared. Hidden in the darkness, Eric was watching them with his Mongolian bow. Only then did Bernard understand why Eric had disappeared and why Allain didn't seem to mind. Indeed, Allain and his methods were extraordinary. "You're too young, you belong to the temple now. Too bad he's too good to be a knight. Anyway, why did you call me?" "I've missed you, and I need information." "It's nice to be missed, but since this is a business meeting, the prices are the same. You know, I have mouths to feed. What is it you want to know?" "Who killed Benjamin the loan shark?" he asked. Bernard wondered why he started with Benjamin. Then he thought of the beggar. The old man had been there in the morning, probably begging there all the time, and he must have watched the whole thing from start to finish. A thin, weak, frail old man, begging there all day long, must have become invisible after a while. When the king said, "The 10 men of Alexandria and Sergio Drupali," Bernard looked at the experienced knight when Allain didn't ask any questions and realized that the man already knew this. Meanwhile, the king continued, "But 10 men went in and 7 came out." "What did Sergio want?" Allain asked, keeping his tension under control. "I don't know, but it wasn't money." "Where is the Alexandrian?" asked Allain. "He took refuge with me," the king said, almost with a grin, snapping his fingers. One of the men waiting in the darkness blew a short, shrill whistle. For a brief wet moment it echoed among the tombs. Then 3 more shadows emerged from the dark shadows. A short, pot-bellied, cowardly-looking man stood between 2 large beggars. Charlotte realized then that the king knew what to ask him, what to demand of him. "My dear Moff," said Allain with a warm smile. "My dear knight," grinned Moff Ibn Rashid of Alexandria, almost lying down in front of Allain and wagging his tail with the slyness of a scrawny stray dog confronted by a big dog. "Will you tell me what happened?" the knight asked. "Of course," said Moff with a wicked grin. "I am a loyal subject of the kingdom and, above all, a devout believer in our church." "I thought you were Jewish," said Allain, raising one eyebrow with a smile. "I could have sworn you were Muslim," John added with a smile. "Sergio asked me for 10 turcopal, but I had Indians." The extremely dark, stubble-bearded, balding man with the top of his head, who decided to ignore them, was saying, "Sergio asked me for 10 turcopal, but I had Indians." When Allain said, "You always have turcopal, Indians are cheaper, aren't they?" he asked with a cocky smile. The man grimaced, shook his head from side to side and said, "Well, yes and no, Your Eminence. Frankly, I couldn't trust Sergio." "Why not?" He seemed more serious than usual. "You know he's always serious, but this time there was something different." "Like what?" "I don't know, but I was clearly scared," he said. "A day later, at midnight last night, she came to me, the Indians had tried to kill her and she tried to kill me for it." He swallowed and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was able to escape because he was wounded. He must have escaped too." "Did you know what he was recruiting for?" asked Allain. Yes, Sergio had always been a serious man, but he was too pure a soul to stray from the path of God or the brotherhood. He was not one to torture people, to hire mercenaries to kill people, and when they turned out to be incompetent, to try to kill the man who had hired them. In fact, no one who really knew Mawf ibn Rashid needed an excuse to kill him. Mawf ibn Rashid was an alibi. A good one. No, but when he attacked Benji I thought it was a robbery, said the man with brown teeth, bags under his eyes and stubble. Where is he now? Asked Allain. The king interjected, Now? I don't know about now, my friend Bears, but I know about before, if that helps you. He said, smiling. It will, said Allain. After he left the pawnbroker, our men followed him to a warehouse at the west gate. Allain snapped his fingers and looked at Bernard. When the young man looked at him puzzled and said, What? Allain said calmly, Pay the king. Why me? Said Bernard, looking from the king to Allain. You have money, I'm a poor knight. Said Allain with great humility, looking as if he really was a saint straight out of the Bible, dignified and humble. Bernard opened and closed his mouth several times in desperation, but there was nothing he could do about it, so he took the money from his sash and poured it into the king's dirty palm. It is a pleasure to work with you, Allain de Bures, the king said to Allain as he mounted his horse, laughing at his desperate suffering. Then he turned back to look at Allain's hidden man, but he was no longer there. He grimaced and muttered, It's a shame really. Only Eric noticed that two shadows were watching them from a distance as Bernard placed his empty pouches on his belt. The young man looked first at the shadows in the darkness and then at Allain de Bures and smiled. Eric was not the only one hiding in the shadows to protect the group, Subute and Lin were probably watching them too. Allain was always on the safe side, he kept his horse safe. End of the chapter 5.